Good morning to everybody. It's really great to see that so many people have landed back in this conference room after a VR flight last night. It's great to have you. It's very impressive. So I'm really proud and excited to be moderating this panel on NATO and EU strategic outlook. I have here with me an exceptional set of people. Christian-Marc Lifländer, head of the Cyber and Hybrid Policy section in the Emerging Security Challenges Division at NATO, IES. Stijn Mals, head of division at the European External Action Service. Wolfgang Röhrig, Head of Unit of Information Superiority, Capability, Armament and Planning Directorate from the European Defence Agency. Margiris Abukevičius, Vice Minister of National Defence of Lithuania. And last but not least, Liesje Klomp, Councillor, Political and Security Department from the Permanent Representation of Netherlands to the EU and NATO. We will be discussing about the cyber dimension, or the lack of thereof, in the strategic documents, the new NATO strategic concept and the EU strategic compass, and the perspectives of NATO-EU cooperation in cyber, or more generally. So, Christian, if you wouldn't mind, I turn to you first. Knowing that NATO declared cyber as a separate military domain in 2016 at the Warsaw Summit. Yet, according to the general public now, while of course this crowd here at CyCon has talked a lot about the role of cyber in Ukraine war, but for the general public, very often there is the notion that there is no cyber war in Ukraine. What would you say? What role does NATO play in cyber in Ukraine, in the war in Ukraine? And what does it mean for the future of cyber measures in warfare as expressed in the new strategic concept?
Thank you, Merle, and good morning to you all. It's good to be back, in person, by the way. I think the virtual thing, well, I really didn't like it. It's like eating canned food. I mean, it fills your stomach, but it's not the real thing. So it's good to be sort of doing business person to person. I'm also sort of cognizant of the fact that we're coming really at the tail end of the conference, and lots of interesting things have been said. So I feel kind of like, I know what I have to do. The question is, can I make it interesting? And I think that's the challenge for the whole panel, right? Now, sort of looking at NATO, looking at the strategic concept, the document, of course, is not out yet. It's being negotiated. So I'm in a really sort of nice position where I can speculate about what it could be and what you perhaps sort of would find in the document. And I'm sure there's going to be other colleagues that will also elaborate on that. But I think sort of having been a part of the previous document in 2010, I think when it comes to cyber, you have this sort of blurb there that there are these sort of cyber attacks that can affect Euro-Atlantic stability and security. Well, obviously the world has changed. Well, you don't find anything on China, for example, in the last strategic concept. So in many ways, I think the question, the challenge is going to be how to make it fit for purpose, how to reflect what on one hand has taken place, and how to still sort of think in relevant terms when it comes to the next 10 years. And I think there's going to be, we should expect some continuity, but also some change. I think what the war in Ukraine tells you is that, well, use of force has not disappeared. It's still very much part of the statecraft. So the collective defense, the defense and deterrence mission, if you will, of NATO is there to stay. Unquestionably so. But I also think the second element of partnerships, I don't really think that no one, however powerful, can go it alone, and I think that's very much part of the future as well. But then there's this sort of piece where that has been bothering me for quite some time, even before the Ukraine thing happened, and that to me is the sort of the notion that quite often, particularly when you look at the technology and how it's being used, a lot is happening below the threshold of the use of force. And I'm referring to something that is not, well, you wouldn't certainly sort of characterize this as war, certainly from a legal perspective, but it's also not peace. And I think this is relevant for this conference when you look at cyberspace, which to me sort of contains the three Cs. It's a sort of permanently contested domain. It's constantly on. And we shouldn't really be looking at the incidents, the sort of retrospectively. I think it's sort of the campaigns that occur over time. So it's the cumulative aspects of the cumulative effects of it. What matters, I think, is that the sort of the strategic competition piece, not peace, not war. I think some have called it unpeace. I think is going to be a challenge, and that challenge is going to be, I think, similar both for the EU and for NATO, and how to operate in that sort of below the threshold scenarios, where I think many of the adversaries will be designing their actions around deterrence, so as to sort of affect elements of state power and get what they want without actually escalating or going beyond, above a certain threshold. I also think, looking ahead, that a lot of that sort of strategic competition will focus on technology. Yes, some of it is going to be about these brilliant new technologies, EDTs, AI, quantum, post-quantum encryption, and what have you. But quite a lot of it is going to be run-of-the-mill, the old sort of the way of doing things. So, but I think the backbone, the sort of where it's going to play out, is still the sort of the technology. So that's going to be at the heart of it. So that's why I think the challenge is going to be for both organizations of how to still sort of deliver that commitment, deliver that mandate that we have. Part of it is having to do with resilience, indeed, deterrence by denial, making sure that you're able to sort of continue business after sustaining the blow. But I think there's still something missing, and that is the sort of not only the deterrence of by denial piece, but also the imposition of costs. And we've been going in that direction. You've seen the attribution statements, you've seen the expressions of solidarity. But I think sort of more can be done. I will sort of be intellectually honest, sort of having listened to General Nakasona's remarks. Sort of my thinking sort of tends to go very much in the same direction when it comes to persistent engagement. Or sort of joint publication 3-12, right? I mean, it's the ability to degrade and create these sort of strategic dilemmas also for our adversaries. That does not necessarily sort of escalate to the level of war, but that is something that one can and arguably should be doing in order to defend really sort of not only the cyberspace, but also the values-based world that we want to still occupy. So I think continuity and change going forward, very much sort of similar challenges. And I think the sort of the golden word here is going to be not necessarily sort of duplication of effort, but complementarity. I think the two organizations fit nicely. NATO's core competence, I would argue, will still remain security and defense. Question is how to make it relevant in all of these decisions. I think we have a lot to learn from what happened with the 5G.
Thank you, Christian. You've very eloquently put about what we could expect in the strategic concept. I would, however, like to tear out of you the role that on your view, that NATO has been playing in the war in Ukraine. Could you comment that a little bit too?
Well, there's NATO as an organization, of course, and what you've seen is the public announcement when it comes to sort of giving Ukraine access to the malware information sharing platform, etc. But I think I'd like to think of NATO in broader terms. I'd like to think of NATO as an alliance, and their allies have done a lot. I would also like to sort of go back to what I said when it comes to cyber. I think what is important is sort of the way we think of cyber. And in many ways, I would say that what happened on the 24th of February was really sort of a culmination. Well, the cyber action in Ukraine has been taking place for a very long time. Ukraine has gotten not only used to it, but has learned a lot of lessons and knows how to defend itself. So allied role, be that sort of by training and education, but also capabilities, and assisting Ukrainians themselves to defend their cyberspace, I think has been significant. Big part of, I think, why some are saying that there hasn't been this sort of shock and awe or like a digital Pearl Harbor, I think it is having to do with exactly that. That it's not, I mean, to me, when I look at cyber, I do not want to subject this to the same level of scrutiny as the sort of conventional domain or as the nuclear domain. I think cyber has its own special characteristics that need to be taken into account. But NATO's role in this regard, I think, in quite often has been to enable, to sort of enable Ukrainians themselves to do the job that they do. They know their networks better, and of course, once again, allies. And then also sort of the private industry, where NATO quite often has been only the sort of perhaps a facilitator and not necessarily the first responder.
Well, thank you for that, and I'm looking into digging in more deeply in some of the concepts that you mentioned here through the course of this panel. But Stijn, turning to you and turning to EU, what role does cyber play in the EU's strategic concept, and how well would you say is EU prepared for cyber attacks following the Russian invasion in Ukraine?
Thank you, Merle, and good morning. Thanks for having me. First time here at CyCon, so very excited to be here. What I can offer, I think, is a bit of a more general perspective on EU security and defense and how cyber fits into that. And I think since 2016, broadly, the EU has consistently developed a number of instruments and tools in the field of security and defense to strengthen defense planning, industrial cooperation, civilian crisis management, but also the fight against hybrid threats. And of course, the fight against cyber threats and strengthening cyber defense has been an integral part of that. With the cyber diplomacy toolbox being developed since 2017, different iterations of a cybersecurity strategy, the last one dated from 2020, and also a cyber defense policy framework, a new one coming up later this year. I'll revert to that a bit later. On the 21st of March, we have adopted the strategic compass, and I'm in the comfortable position to actually refer to you to the document. It's available online. I highly recommend it. It's a very readable document, perhaps contrary to usual EU talk. It's also a very actionable document because each and every chapter ends with a number of action boxes and timeline and describes what needs to be done. The compass is in itself not a reaction to Ukraine. I think it's important to note. We started work on that 2 years back, and it clearly builds on everything that has been done. But of course, it integrates the events since the 24th of February. The compass in itself is not focused exclusively on cyber. In fact, it's a lot more broader. It offers really the comprehensive geostrategic perspective and everything that needs to be done in the field of security and defense. But cyber is clearly a very important part of it. And I did a little search yesterday evening. I found the word cyber 82 times in the compass, and it's a little over 40 pages. So I think that's a good illustration of the fact that the compass clearly recognizes cyber as one of the contested strategic domains, clearly labeling actions by Russia, by China, also North Korea and Iran as part of a threat analysis, and then developing a number of actions that we propose over the next 5 to 10 years. And I'll perhaps briefly run through them in terms of what we believe needs to be done. First and foremost, rules. We believe it is essential to maintain an open, free, stable, and secure cyberspace, and we will continue to promote rules and international norms for responsible state behavior in this regard. As one of the other speakers said yesterday, the rules-based international orders is ours to lose, and I would say it's ours to build, and that certainly will be a key part of our effort from the EU side going ahead. We need to increase situational awareness, stimulate information exchange and cooperation between our intelligence agencies, between our cybersecurity agencies, and perhaps there is scope there to increase our cooperation with NATO as well. We have just developed the EU cyber posture, signaling our determination to provide immediate, long-term and tailored responses to threat actors. We're also looking into strengthening the different measures we have available as part of our EU cyber diplomacy toolbox, including possible additional response measures and sanctions. So far, you know that the toolbox has been used almost 20 times, most recently on the 10th of May, with the targeted and coordinated attribution of the KSAT attack by Russia. Exercises, also a key part of our effort. We concluded earlier this year, together with the French presidency of the Council, a scenario-based cycles exercise. And I think these are very valuable in terms of increasing our readiness, in terms of lessons learned, and also through the parallel and coordinated exercises with NATO, we can test our coordinated responses and link them up with the other crisis management tools we have available at the EU level, including Article 42.7, the Mutual Assistance Clause. We need to support our civilian CSDP, our military CSDP missions and operations worldwide. Their cybersecurity needs to be strengthened. And of course, linked to that, we need to support partners a lot more in terms of their resilience thinking of Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, obviously, but also the Western Balkans. Later this year, as I said, and this is one of the key components or key proposals in the strategic compass, we will put forward a new EU cyber defense policy framework. And I think what you will see there is that this will set out our vision for the next 5 to 10 years in terms of priority areas, key deliverables on all of the topics that I've just mentioned. And perhaps it would be a pleasure for me to come back next year and talk to you in a bit more detail about that cyber defense policy framework. Turning very quickly to the capability side, because of course that's also very important. We will try to leverage the different tools we have at EU level, the European Defence Funds, the permanent structured cooperation, to stimulate joint development, procurement even of the necessary capabilities, while stimulating the EU's industrial and technological base. As you will have seen, the EU Council, the European Council met earlier this week. Our heads of state and government adopted a set of conclusions, including on security and defense, and they have actually discussed a report on defense investment gaps and what needs to be done in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine to strengthen our capacities across the board. But it also has some very interesting comments on cyber, including the need to strengthen our C2, situational awareness exercises, but also full spectrum cyber capabilities. To quote maybe in the PESCO framework as well, we have the Cyber Rapid Response Teams, has been a very successful project. It's led by Lithuania. Perhaps we will revert to that later as well, because it's important in the context of what we've been doing in Ukraine as well. Lastly, partners, an essential part as well of the strategic compass. NATO, by the way, is quoted, I think, 30 times in the document. We look forward to see how the strategic concept will reflect the NATO's relationship with the EU. But from our side, this is a key strategic partnership that needs to be further developed. Cyber is part and parcel of that since 2016. There is scope to do more, including on EDTs, including on innovation, research, capacities, and we look forward to taking that forward after the Madrid summit. So all in all, a lot of work in the next 5 to 10 years, and look forward to discussing that further with you.
Indeed, thanks very much. Thanks for that. Wolfgang, I turn to you and to the European Defence Agency, EDA. What is its role in cyber? What is its vision about cyber, and how do you interact with both NATO and EU?
Yes, thanks a lot. And Stijn already gave me all the hooks for my intervention, because he mentioned all the different initiatives in place at the moment. But before I will go into this actual situation of today, I want to do a little look back, because one of the things is about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity and chance to build up the cyber defense program in the agency from the scratch. And I was really sitting 10 years ago in front of a blank sheet of paper. How should such a program could look like? And one of the first lines I drew at that time on this blank sheet of paper was for sure already the cooperation and dialogue with NATO, because I was myself working for NATO before. Therefore, that was for me, from the EU side, a given thing from the beginning. And as Stijn already mentioned, since 2016, a lot of changes have taken place. And here I want to dwell on this, what was mentioned already, from the capability development perspective, because that's the bread and butter business of the agency, to support member states in capability development in the entire spectrum of defense capabilities. And 2011, 2012, cyber defense came on this agenda with a revision of the capability development plan. And here, now looking into today, I also have here the reference to the different defense initiatives, starting with PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, as one of these initiatives after the global strategy in 2016. it's an instrument with a high political visibility, and this is very advancing our capability development. We have nowadays 60 PESCO projects in place, of which 5 are cyber-related. The Lithuanian led already mentioned, but there are also other projects which will, in the long term, contribute to improving the capability landscape in Europe. Then over to another initiative coming out of the same time frame, the so-called Coordinated Annual Review on Defense, CARD. So this gives us an instrument with which we, in a 2-year cycle, can make an assessment how have capabilities developed in Europe, in European member states. So we are doing this dialogue with member states every 2 years to really look where is progress, where is not so much progress. And already mentioned also by Stijn, are for sure also the initiatives which have been launched by the Commission, the European Defence Fund, with its 2 precursor initiatives. On the one hand side, the Preparatory Action for Defence-related Research and the European Defence Industrial Development Programme, EDIDP. This is for the first time that defense, and also cyber defense, has access to EU common funding. This is really a novelty, and when we look into the situation when it started in 2017 to the outlook 2027, there will be, out of the EU common funding, around 9 billion euros available for defense capability development. I think this is a good incentive for member states to do more together, because that is one of the mantras of this. And in today's situation, at the moment, 3 projects are benefiting, cyber projects are benefiting from the EDIDP, so the precursor program, with a volume of about 27 million. And we are at the moment waiting for the results of the first EDF call from last year. And here we can also expect that major projects will come up with a cyber reference. So out of the call, there is roughly 33 million available for cyber topics. And now, with that, the bigger landscape, I want to drill down a little bit on 2 projects which are currently run in the agency. That is, on the one hand side, I would say a structural project for establishing a network of military certs. Everybody would expect, oh, this should be already exist. No, that's not the case. And here we have to foster the cooperation between the member states and their military certs, because they are one of the key operational capabilities when really massive attacks will hit armed forces, being it home-based or being it in operations. So I think this is one of the key projects which is referencing back to the latest cybersecurity strategy. So here we are putting efforts. So, for example, we started this with an EDA-funded project, the so-called MILCERT Interoperability Conference, where we will do next week another iteration, the strategic track with the heads of MILCERT to discuss the results of an exercise we did earlier this year with the MILCERT community. And another project I want to mention here is one of the EDIDP projects, where we were asked by the contributing members who won this project that we do for them the project management. And this is also, from my point of view, a project which hits into or points to the future, because that's a project for the development of a European cyber awareness platform, eCySAP, which has a history in the agency. So we started some years ago developing an initial architecture for such a project. Then this was picked up by a handful of member states for a follow-on project to develop here a research prototype. And now the current project, which is benefiting roughly 18 million euros from the EDIDP, aims to develop here an operational demonstrator. So this shows clearly the development over time from an initial idea over research into an operational capacity. And I think this is one of the things, and I want to stop with these two examples. I could name here many more about how to create impact here with such kind of capability development projects to shape the future in cyber defense, because one of the things, even if we think we are good, we can always get better, and this is part of getting better. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. It's great to see how confirmed and positive you are about it. It feels like if you are so enthusiastic about it, good things will happen in EDA. Recognizing that there are so many of us, Margiris, Abukevičius, I turn to you. As Christian earlier said, NATO ultimately is at the hand of its allies. You are a NATO ally, EU member state as well, but mostly looking at NATO. What would you say, how well is NATO ready to tackle the challenges posed in cyber from an allied perspective? Also, 2 weeks ago, NATO cyber coordinators met in Brussels. You are the one to go to these meetings from Vilnius. What do you want to make out of that format? Please tell us.
Okay, thanks. First, I appreciate the possibility to be here. It's the first time for me. I envy those who spend 3 days. Maybe next time I should come and plan, a bit more time to really participate in all those discussions. And I'll come back to your question on NATO. But I think first, it is important to say that a very good starting point for our discussion is what is happening now in Ukraine. And your first question was about that. I believe that in all different panels, people were, despite what topic was on the panel, were going back to the Ukraine because it is important. I think everyone sees a very brutal, a very conventional 20th century type war in Ukraine, and you rightly said that maybe in public it's not that visible what is happening in cyber. But I would say from my contacts with Ukrainians and from contacts with people who are closely observing the situation, I think what we see there is a full-fledged cyber war. Not only because of unprecedented scale, although not very visible, but also some sophistication. So definitely, first we should help Ukraine to win also in that domain. But also, I think what is important, we have to, learn Ukraine lessons together. Together with Ukrainians, when I say we, I mean you and NATO. Second, I think it is important to clearly say that cyber should be an important part of its long-term adaptation. NATO is ongoing thinking, and Madrid summit will be an important milestone in setting the direction for the NATO long-term adaptation. On the conventional side, on kinetic side, of course, we are talking about moving to forward defense to really changing a NATO posture. But the main question: what does it mean for cyber? What does forward defense? What does new NATO defense posture mean for cyber? I think that is the main question we have to answer. And I see that you are trying to bring me to this NATO topic only, but I think coming from country which is EU and NATO, and I will share some of the ideas which I think we should focus in the future. but they are as relevant, to NATO, EU, but also for national cyber capacity building. So first, and I'm surprised that I haven't heard this from my colleagues, panelists, this public-private partnership, which has been discussed, I think, in the context of Ukraine very often recently. And I really agree that it is probably a momentum where we see it differently, but there is a momentum to move forward on increasing this public-private partnership. Private companies were very quick to help Ukraine. They were very proactive in sharing the intelligence, and I think we should really, taking this ad hoc mechanism we are developing now, we should think how to make them more structured, turn into more structured dialogue. But I think there is one caveat here. I think we should not understand this dialogue as that we want to outsource some of the capabilities. I think it is important that our public-private partnership is a complementary to what we do on national basis, what we do on multinational basis, and how we develop our capabilities. So it's complementary. We should not rely only on private. And I think what is important also to stress that it is working, and it is a very interesting model for the future, because it's not about selling, buying, type of relationship. I think everyone understands when it comes to Ukraine, what's happening there are much bigger things at stake, and everyone has to contribute to really solving that. Second issue, which has been already mentioned with referring to Lithuanian Cyber Rapid Response Teams project. But I think also if we read the European documents, recent documents about creating a joint cyber unit and rapid response capacities, in NATO also discussions, and I'm glad that US is leading discussions on virtual cyber rapid response teams and so on. And I'm glad that Lithuania, with some of the member states which are also represented, Netherlands, also Estonia, we have been ahead of this discussion 5 years ago when we established that cyber rapid response project. And in 5 years we have reached a full operational capability. We have clearly defined the profiles we need to have in those teams. We have developed procedures. We have done many trainings together. We have identified interoperable tools, which is important, and we are ready to share that experience, which we developed in a multilateral framework with EU and NATO. And definitely, this is a scarce resource, and it showed Ukraine situation showed all different scenarios which talk about some spillover effects from Ukraine. Clearly indicates that we need to develop that capacity at multinational level, not only national. It can help to manage incidents. It can also be useful in resilience testing and penetration testing. It can really be helpful in supporting partners, as in the case of Ukraine. And I sometimes hear that maybe this is a duplication between EU and NATO. So I would say that in this context, there is probably not too many of cyber teams. It cannot be too many cyber rapid response teams. So it is again a complementary. I would see it as a complementary what we are doing nationally on multinational level, EU and NATO. The third, the resilience building was mentioned, but I would like to look into it through the lenses of mandatory versus voluntary. Standards, requirements, and so on. I think that is a momentum where we should really, move from voluntary type of discussions. It would be nice to have, if someone would do that, to really, setting some mandatory standards both in EU and NATO. We are doing at some extent that in both, but I think we definitely have good instruments to go further. On NATO side, we have Cyber Defense Pledge, which can really be a tool to set some mandatory standards. We have defense spending benchmarks. Why not to have cybersecurity, benchmarks on NATO side? When it comes to EU, we are now talking a lot about digital and investing into digital. But why not to have a cybersecurity, percentage, dedicated percentage, how much you should spend on cybersecurity when you develop digital programs and so on. We are all struggling nationally to do that, but the collective effort, I think, would be much more efficient. And I will probably, respond to your question, which you posed in the end about both national cyber coordinators meetings in NATO. I think that is, what NATO has started is a very good direction to go. I think it is a very good direction for NATO because definitely NATO, when it comes to cyber, should go beyond NATO networks. And if you have around the table national cyber coordinators, definitely this discussion goes beyond NATO networks, because all those people are coming with much bigger responsibilities, for national responsibilities, and much bigger focus. So I think that is a very perspective way to help NATO to do more beyond the NATO networks. It's also a good tool because I think the common topic here is also what EU and NATO could do together. So bringing those national coordinators with responsibilities on EU and NATO side also helps to achieve complementarity. So I will probably stop here and ready for the discussion. Thanks.
Well, thank you for this very, very intelligent and deep look into a set of things from your national perspective. Liesje, Klomp, how would you complement that? How well, as you see it from the perspective of Netherlands, is EU as well as NATO dealing with the cybersecurity challenge, and what's more there to do for the years to come through the new different strategic documents?
Well, thank you, and also from my side, pleasure to be here. I've been very much enjoying the conference so far, and I hope after your breakfast, at least it's good to see such a nice full of room at the final part of this conference. It's a subject that's very dear to my heart, being from a nation that was one of the founding nations of both NATO and EU. And when it comes about the challenge that cyber poses to EU and its member states, it's to a large extent the same threat that NATO is facing. However, we have to be mindful of the different mandate both organizations have. The EU was born out of economic cooperation and is an organization with soft power tools as a regulator. And NATO, of course, is created for political military cooperation with hard power tools. So the different mandate both organizations have means that a response from either of the organizations is perceived differently. And this is something that the Netherlands, as a member of both, always carefully assesses when we are working on trying to see how we want to respond or if there is a need to respond. And the EU is prepared to tackle the challenges malicious cyber activities pose through the EU cyber diplomacy toolbox, as mentioned by Stijn. It's underlining that the EU is ready to respond to external cyber threats that cause malicious significant impact or systemic effect on the EU with a range of measures, including sanctions. And this framework for joint EU diplomatic response is part of the EU's approach to cyber diplomacy, and it contributes to conflict prevention, the mitigation of cybersecurity threats, greater stability in international relations, and we feel that the framework has encouraged cooperation, facilitated in mitigation of immediate and long-term threats, and also intends to influence the behavior of potential aggressors in the long term. Of course, there it's very hard to justify and measure your impact. But in 2020, the EU came out with declarations condemning malicious cyber activity, for instance, on the cyber attack against Georgia. But we also imposed the first sanctions under the EU sanction regime. And the Netherlands was one of the driving forces behind both the toolbox as well as the sanctions regime. And one of the reasons for our determination to be able to have a strong response was the attempted cyber attack by the Russian GRU to the OPCW in The Hague in 2018. Another reason for our determination is our strong belief in values. And values have been one of the returning elements in multiple sessions throughout the conference, and rightfully so. It's part of our commitment to achieve an open, free, stable, and secure cyberspace. And hence, before the publication of the EU cybersecurity strategy, the Netherlands, in conversations with the EAS and other member states, highlighted our priorities and focus on both values, but also on other issues where we felt the EU should be doing more. And one of these being the intersection of economic security and cyber and critical infrastructure. Secondly, intellectual property theft. And thirdly, disinformation. And cybersecurity strategy came out at the end of 2020, and I think a lot of you will recognize that ever since, the need to be increasing our focus on these issues has only increased. And the EU's cybersecurity strategy was one of the guided documents also in assuring that cyber was mainstreamed throughout the EU. Supported by the Horizontal Working Party on Cyber Issues that advises the Council both on internal cyber threats as well as external issues. So it works with both the EAS, where Stijn is the representative from, but also with the Commission. And the strategic compass that Stijn just spoke about will take our work further. And it's the document that's been addressing areas where we now need to focus on and in view of the current trends. But it, in our view, also is a document that starts to fill out sort of the gray area between the EU and NATO. And one of the first documents that actually brought the work of the compass further was last week's publication of the Cyber Posture. The posture aims to demonstrate EU's determination to provide immediate and long-term responses to threat actors, seeking to deny the EU a secure and open access to cyberspace and affect its strategic interests, including the security of its partners. So also there, in those sort of statements and documents, the EU is clearly signaling how much we attach to be working to advance our values, but also to be working with our partners, NATO being one of the first and foremost. And in a world where our adversaries are trying to undermine our unity, to spread disinformation, and are aggressive against all of us, the Netherlands is a strong believer in the power of a joint response. And the fact that declarations on cyber incidents at SolarWinds, as well as Microsoft Exchange Server, were published by both the EU and NATO at the same day were not a coincidence. Then, in our view, this is actually one of the successes, not only of the EU, but also for the larger international community, because it did not only signal that we were united, but it also signaled that we are united in order to uphold the cyber norms that we agreed by the UN framework for responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And currently, not only the EU and NATO are working on how to contribute to this normative framework and also increasing efforts to mainstream cyber, a lot of capitals are still working on how to organize their interagency processes for non-kinetic threats. And We hope that the EU's strategic compass and the EU's and NATO's strategic concept will be putting this on the forefront of all of our agendas, and hopefully assist us in avoiding any unnecessary duplication, but also in assuring meaningful complementarity between the EU and NATO. And in order to foster this complementarity, the Netherlands also, before NATO published its new cyber defense policy, tried to influence that process as well, just as we did on the EU side. And on the opening day of this conference, the Netherlands Ministry of Defense released their new strategy, the Defensienota. And the subtitle of this strategy is Investing in a Strong NATO and EU. And currently, the Netherlands is working on a new cybersecurity strategy that will also be referring and supporting our efforts in this domain. So this all underlines the priority that the Netherlands attaches to EU-NATO cooperation. And you could actually say that I am EU-NATO cooperation in the flesh, given that I am the Dutch cyber diplomat, both at our permanent representation to the EU, as well as our representation to NATO.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much. It's good to see a concrete example of EU-NATO cooperation here on the panel. Well, with this, I'd open up the floor for questions from the audience. There's quite a few of you, and through previous panels, I've seen that this audience is curious, asking difficult questions, wanting to know and really push people on the panel. Feel free to do this. Please raise a hand if you'd like to ask a question. Yes, I see one here in the front.
Thanks. Josh Gold with the Government of Canada. So my question's about information sharing, but specifically intelligence sharing. General Nakasone told us that democracies have allies and autocracies have clients. And so to work as allies, we need, as the panel said, capability development, joint operations, enabling others, like in Ukraine, as Mr. Lifländer spoke about. And that seems to me like you'd need a lot of intelligence sharing, and indeed all these conferences always talk about intel sharing or info sharing. So it's long talked about, but what are the main specific impediments to better information sharing, specifically with intelligence? And I don't mean just like we need to build trust or confidence, but maybe some of the panelists could point to specific examples of the challenges or specific cases of where intelligence sharing was improved. And then just to close with, is there a clear end goal for intelligence sharing of where that should end up? Or is it a continuous process of trying to get better and better? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Christian, do you want to take a first
Yes.
view on that?
Thanks, Josh. Always the easy questions on Intel. So my experience with Intel has been that well, there's no sort of one sort of solution that would sort of cover everything. I think that there are a couple of issues that go into it. Unfortunately, I have to say that sometimes it's about shame. People do not want to share that they've been targeted or successfully targeted because it potentially carries a stigma with it, which quite often prevents the rest of us from learning and improving. So I think there's still a bit of a sort of, like I said, a stigma issue to it of being sort of attacked or being successfully targeted. I think we should get over it. I think it's almost like a sort of it has become normal that we're all suffering from these attacks. I see sometimes also sort of the issues of politics to go with it, but also sort of more than that. I mean, at one point, and you know that, right? I mean, we created this MISP that I also alluded to in the context of Ukraine. It was kind of like the Kevin Costner movie, The Field of Dreams. Build it and they will come. And they did come, but an interesting thing started to happen. In other words, people were not sharing everything with everybody. They shared things with those that they trusted and that they had relationships with. So in many ways, when I look at NATO's role, I guess what we have done and will continue to do is to provide that ecosystem, but then the rest of it is for the players, right? I mean, to fulfill that sort of ecosystem with data. And here, I mean, there are some very simple rules. There's trust. I need to know originator control. I need to know what you're doing with my data. Second, reciprocity. I mean, this is not just for the purposes of sharing. I want something in return. So some very simple rules apply. And then there's, of course, industry. And I think industry is an interesting case in a sense that what my observations have been that, if there's no liability or a commercial issue involved, it's okay to share because that actually sort of benefits all. I mean, rising tide lifts all the boats. But not all industry partners, if I may say so, are also created equal. So the primes, if I may say so, perhaps are more capable and can play that role. Making that link, by the way, going back to what Liesje was saying, also to the norms and to the kind of sort of open ecosystem, open intranet that we want to preserve. It's not the sort of the state-driven, state-controlled model proposed by Russia and China. But free, open, multi-stakeholder domain. So I think in many ways I'm hopeful when it comes to industry as well, because we're in it together, to be very honest. It's just the modalities that I think that we need to pay attention to. So I think ad hoc solutions sometimes put in place and sporadic success, but quite often it's not sort of not the technological kinds of issues that play a role. But much more sort of sometimes a transactional nature of that business as well, of what is it that I'm going to get out of it, and not really doing it for the world peace, but for a very clear policy objective as well. That's, I guess, sort of my experience over the last 10 years.
Well, thank you. That's very good. And you yourself, Christian, in your response, included this incentive about how the interaction with the private sector is rolling out in the context of the war of Ukraine. Indeed, I think a number of private enterprises have made a very clear value choice in this war in Ukraine. Could I push you a little even ahead in this context of information sharing? I've heard repeatedly various NATO officials say that this is definitely one of the lessons learned regarding NATO's cooperation with the private sector. But what exactly is there? How would you see NATO could institutionalize this lesson or this good spirit momentum that we currently have, that NATO has regarding information sharing with the private sector actors? What longer-term implications are there for this for NATO?
Thank you for being pushed to the rest of them as well.
I shall, and
I haven't had my morning workout, so it's all good to sort of take it on. I think, industry's role, I think, has been crucial in many ways, and lots of companies that have played role, quite often free of charge. Indeed, because of the sort of I think also very much the values proposition part that is involved in this conflict. Sort of when I look at existing best practice out there in the nations, UK, for example, the Industry 100, whereby I think we can develop collaborative models that do not necessarily sort of have to be based entirely and only on commercial interests. I think it is possible to sort of take a look at how to create this win-win sort of situations and incentives for both sides. And I think there are two core competencies, right? I mean, the government gets the mandate. I mean, it has the social compact. Its main task is to ensure security of the nation. And at the same time, industry develops the technology. It is the sort of the biggest player in this regard. I don't see that as mutually exclusive, vice versa. I see it as complementary. I think the question just remains of, some have used the word institutionalize. I think the sort of the trick here is how to remain practical and pragmatic in these interactions. Not all industry partners will be created equal, but I do believe the sort of the build it and they will come sort of principle in this regard.
Thank you. Would any of you be interested in? Yes, please, Martin.
Yeah, maybe I'll share my views, and I really share your question that every time we speak about cybersecurity, there is a kind of mantra that we speak about information sharing, and that everything and the main argument is we need to build the trust first. And this is partly true, but I think what the current situation with Ukraine shows that sometimes even more important than the trust is a mutual interest and the mutual mutual threat and very imminent threat. And I think that is a driving force behind what is happening now in terms of information sharing. And again, I would say my view that in the context of what is happening in Ukraine, we have an unprecedented level of information sharing between partners. And it's not because we have built, and yes, we have built through years a trust, but the main incentive is a mutual interest and a mutual imminent threat. And I would, you asked about whether some good examples. I could also give example, our national example, and would mention another flagship, Lithuanian flagship project, Regional Cyber Defense Center. 4 member states signatories of that: Lithuania, US, Ukraine, and Georgia. And naturally, the focus of that center and of cyber threat analysis cell there is Ukraine. But we see a big interest from other neighboring countries, Latvia, Poland, very actively participating and sharing the information. We see much more agencies from those countries taking United States. It's not only defense agencies, but other agencies responsible for critical infrastructure interested in sharing and so on. Again, private sector is interested to come in and put information they have and see how you can come up with a joint analysis and a joint fusion of that information. So there are good examples. Not only this, there are good examples on like-minded group of countries, more ad hoc information sharing. But I would say that the key in this context is mutual interest and effort.
Thank you.
Well, I gladly take the easiest part of Josh's question, which was the last one. Is there like an end state, or is it a process? I think obviously it's a continuous process that will have to be incremental in the years ahead. I think perhaps to complement, I think it's about trust. Obviously, it's in part about stigma, as mentioned, but I think it's also part about not wanting to share publicly the capacities that some of our member states may have to actually detect cyber threats and cyber attacks. So I think that's also a very important part of it. And I think projects such as just mentioned by Margiris, where several member states come together in smaller circles, may actually help to build that trust and that cooperation. At the EU level, of course, we do not have proper intelligence capacities or capabilities, but we can offer the framework for member states who are willing and able to do so, to share this in a safe space.
Thank you. I saw another hand in the audience, please. And then in the back then, yes.
Matthias Gömpel from German Cyber Reserve, asking a question from a lecturer point of view. In many aspects, I do that. I realize that you explain a lot about the concepts. Are we all confident that the idea of the concepts will reach the people who will in 5 years have to take over? Do you think what we currently explain here in that audience could reach those people who would really have to be active in translating these concepts into action? And I'd say in 5 years, because these are that's the horizon for training people. They are probably not the ones who are in today, but they have to take over the people of 18, 20, 25.
Thank you. Wolfgang, you nodded. Do you have an idea?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and I just reach back to the history again in my team. So I was the first program manager of cyber defense in EDA. It's now the third we have. And this is part of this handover. And education and training is a crucial element, which I always stress in many of my presentations. Cyber defense is not only the technology, and as stressed also yesterday in the Ukraine panel, it's people, processes, and technology, this balance. And we clearly, first of all, have to recruit the people. We are clearly, as the military, competing here with the private sector, with the other governmental sectors. So this is one of the important things. And those people we have to bring them up to speed. And this is, for example, also one of the topics where at this stage, cooperation with NATO is, I think, one of the best topics here. And one of the new PESCO projects, the Cyber Academy and Innovation Hub, this is a project coordinated by Portugal, by accident by Portugal, which is also the host nation for the NATO Cyber Academy. And this is, I think, where we are able to mutually exchange, benefit from each new course, training course development, new concept development in this. So there I see the potential. But the strongest point here is, first, we have to get the right people. And we are clearly in the cyber defense area, in the armed forces, compared to the manpower requirements we have, still undermanned.
Thanks. Thanks. Christian, you wanted to comment too?
Yeah, perhaps to start with a funny story. I just recently had an opportunity to meet with young social media influencers globally.
You gathered them in NATO?
Yes. Well, I quickly realized that I was a dinosaur because, the moment I started talking about the sort of norms for responsible state behavior and international law, I lost my audience. Anyways, this was all about sort of, young people are different, if I may say so.
Here to elaborate?
Well, in a good way, they're not like me. So, but in a ways, but it's not that they're not interested. I think it's just that their view on it is a bit sort of different, right? I mean, they've grown up with all of the digital devices, and your question was about what to do with folks in their 80s and 20s and so forth. So I think a big part of it is indeed the sort of us doing our piece, and I think we have to do our piece when it comes to sort of the institutions and the organizations. As a matter of fact, when I think of this sort of strategic competition, that's my theoretical framework that I'm using in order to understand what needs to be done. I think information sharing, actually going back to Josh's point, is a big one, right? If you want to compete, you have to understand what's happening. What's hitting you, I mean, not only what you have, what's hitting you, and how can you, signal that bad things are happening and you're not okay with it. So information sharing, I think, for all I care, NATO becoming part of the CSIC network, mark that down. There are sort of opportunities as well as the sort of capacity building and education and training, but there's more, I think, when it comes to young folks, because over time we will move into this sort of metaverse. We will have the digital avatars, and sort of how to behave in that space. I think that's going to be a bit of a challenge. I'm not so sure that it's the institutions that is the answer. I think I would go really beyond that, and not only the sort of the specialized educational facilities, but really sort of educating our citizens, our people, of how to defend themselves in that cyberspace. Well, the best that I could come up with for the social media the influencers was basically don't click on suspicious links, change your passwords often, and just implement two-factor authentication. And they were happy.
Well, good for that. Yes, please. We should have a mic.
Thank you. Hi, Amy from CCD-COE. It has been fascinating to hear about all the initiatives and strategic developments at NATO, EU, EDA, and I was wondering how far these extend to partners, so states who aren't members but are nonetheless very willing to engage. Are there limitations to how far there could be information shared, cooperation, and if so, what's being done to kind of bring out some more of this, especially around the globe outside Europe? Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, so partners. Who feels... Well,
I think that was a question more for the EU and NATO, how they see, but I can give member states' perspective. And again, going back to what is happening now and Ukraine, and how important it is also for us to see what is happening in Ukraine in terms. So again, going back to information sharing, I think that is one of really issues to look in the future. Beyond that, we definitely through our partnerships longer term have very clear programs on capacity development for our partners, Ukraine, starting with Ukraine and so on. But information sharing and how we can bring them more structurally into those networks we have, because we are benefiting. It's not only that they need that, but we also need to see what is happening beyond the EU and NATO, and very often it is linked, and we are talking about those spillover effects and so on. So I would emphasize that beyond the traditional capacity building and so on, we should think of how to associate them to some of the networks we have.
Okay. Liesje, you wanted to?
Yeah, I want to compliment. Thank you for the question. For PESCO projects, there is a possibility for non-EU nations to be a member. For instance, the US, and if I recall correctly, Canada also is one of the nations that's able to be part of a couple of the PESCO projects if they are willing to do so. In the case of the UK, because of Brexit, it still is something that's being worked out. I hope we're able to sort this out. But in the meantime, as a member state and as an EU ally, of course, there's still a lot of contact between nations as well, bilaterally, that will be feeding into those organizations as well. And that's also something that we've seen when it comes to, for instance, Ukraine and assisting Ukraine. They're both EU and NATO have been pushed by member states and allies to coordinate, and not only to coordinate with all the nations that they are representative of, but also with the other partners that were very active there. Nations such as Australia, where the Netherlands has been cooperating a lot with them on Ukraine ever since MH17. We made sure that all those partners were included in all our cooperation. So I'm very certain that we will be seeing a need to increase more and more, considering the fact that, as many people have been saying, resources are scarce. So we need to assure that we're not duplicating unnecessary and assure that we are benefiting and learning the lessons learned from each other wherever we can. And I hope that we will be able to do so, and also count on organizations such as the Centers of Excellence, as the CCD-COE here as well, could play a part in fostering outreach to a broad audience like the audience we have here today.
I definitely agree with the last thought. Stijn, what about the EU? How successful is the EU in that regard, more generally, in engaging with partners in cybersecurity capacity building?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and just to echo what my co-panelists have said, of course, I spoke about the strategic compass. It has a separate chapters on partnerships. I only spoke about NATO because that was the topic of the panel, but of course it touches upon on other countries as well. As I said, the compass was adopted on the 21st of March, so less than a month after the 24th of February. And in between that period of time, of course, we had to take a long and hard look at the strategic compass and adapt some of the language. And one of the things that was significantly strengthened in the final version of the compass is precisely this. Strengthening resilience of partners, including the Western Balkans, Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, in the wake of the Russian aggression on Ukraine. So I think going forward, that is something that you will see a lot more attention and a lot more financial means being attached to them. We already currently have cyber security or cyber dialogues with a number of countries, obviously, I think, including with Ukraine. We are using tools such as the European Peace Facility to help strengthen cyber capabilities, for instance, in Ukraine, but also going forward in other countries. We invite other countries to align, of course, with our attribution statements or with our sanctions regime. So I think on the whole partnership basket, you will see a lot more activity and a lot more attention than perhaps we had anticipated before the 24th of February.
Thank you. Wolfgang, did you feel like you wanted to add something,
from the EDA, we are a little bit limited in this area. Here I'm quite open and frank that for really cooperation with partners, we need a so-called administrative arrangement with this partner nation, with the MOD. So we have this in place, for example, with Ukraine, but also with Switzerland, with Norway, and we are currently negotiating also an administrative arrangement with the US, with the expectation to have this in place later this year, early next year. But I want to stress another aspect already mentioned by Stijn. There are for sure, beyond the defense community, certain initiatives of the EU for capacity building in partner nations and in partner regions. And this is one of the things strongly also fostered by the EU Commission. I see one partnership project here in the room, so with a CyberNet, which clearly tries to pool expertise within the EU on cyber to use this pool of expertise to train partner nations to build up their own capacities.
No, you are very right, and EU CyberNet is one. In that regard, from personal experience from the e-governance Academy, know that EU is doing a lot in Ukraine. The e-governance Academy is doing a lot together with the EU in places like Western Balkans, in Moldova, with Albania, Macedonia, North Macedonia, and Montenegro and beyond. So that is true. There's been, yes, one. Please, I'll take the question from the back and then from here, from the front.
Yes, John Haas, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, where we are training the next generation of cyber warriors. But we talk about private-public partnership. Private enterprise is subject to things like profit and the need for shareholders. So how do we maintain over a longer term? It's great for a little while, but the interest wanes when it looks like the economy is not doing as well. How do we keep the public-private partnership working in the face of their different motivations?
Good question, difficult to answer. Who wants to tackle it?
I want to tackle it partially. This approach of public-private partnership is clearly also an approach the EU is doing. And again, here I have to reference to the Commission. They are doing here a very good job. They have established certain initiatives, and here I want to mention one, the European Cybersecurity Organization, as one of the main bearers at the moment for this public-private partnership between the EU and EU member states governments and the European industry. So this is one of the things. For sure, on the question, the ups and downs of the economy, well, for the defense economy, I think when I look into the different programs which were announced by all our member states at the moment, the defense industry should not have major concerns at the moment about their revenues. But here I think it's the important aspect that this not only goes to the classical defense industries, but also that a certain amount or a reasonable amount of this goes into cybersecurity and cyber defense. So this is also one of the things why we put in the defense investment gap analysis, which was published earlier this month, also cyber as one of the explicit topics.
Thank you. On NATO side?
Yeah, actually we're going to have two answers. One, I'm going to go back to the partnership thing because, well, I invite you to take a look at it not only as a mean in itself, but a means to an end, right? I mean, when I look at what's happening globally, and I do business with like more than 60 countries across the world, and there's a huge demand for cyber, but it's not equal. Everybody wants different things. So consequently, when you think of it, it needs to be tailored, and you really have to take into account what is it that we're talking about. Some indeed want hardware and software transfer and want to improve. Some want to sort of contribute, see that as a sort of a two-way street and so forth. But what matters here, I think, is that, and sort of once again to connect it to a bigger strategic discussion, I think there are a lot of folks that are still sitting on the fence when it comes to the future of the internet, the kinds of norms. I mean, look at the sort of conversations that take place in GGE, the open-ended working group, etc. So when I look at it, I mean, the question that I have is how can we shape that cyberspace, and how can we shape it according to our values and our norms? And that's really, to me, is the sort of where the technical means and the assistance and the work with the partners is important, but it's for a certain strategic objective as well, and we shouldn't really shy away from it. And stuff that we do, stuff that EU does, to be very honest, I think capacity building is one of the areas where we should collaborate a lot. And when it comes to industry, yes, I hear you on the profit part. To be very honest, from a NATO perspective, we're in an easier position, I think, because we're not regulators. We're not regulating the market, so there's less of a conflict of interest in this regard. I think when it comes to security and defense issues, and going back to intel sharing, for example, there's less of a commercial interest involved quite often, but it is contextual. And I do agree that at the end of the day, I mean, whatever business model you put in place, there need to be incentives for that to take place. Not all of that can be or would be sort of money related. But unless you figure it out, not only when it comes to organizations, NATO and EU institutions, but also at the national level. There are some really interesting best practices that we are picking up when we talk to the allies. So I'm not as dire. I think it's quite hopeful, but it is contextual, and I think first and foremost, both sides really need to sort of understand like what's in it for them. If you're not able to figure that one out, I mean, I think it's a bit of a lunacy to expect that sort of to emerge and happen just because you want it to happen. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
Thank you. I have a very practical question on public-private partnership with NATO and the EU. Just yesterday I got an email from my Air Force Academy classmate who's now working for a hot Silicon Valley startup on quantum. Since they're not our sponsors, I'm not going to tell their name, but question is, our head of government affairs is currently evaluating where in NATO and EU could they be talking about quantum information sciences, post-quantum cryptography, quantum alternative navigation in a denied environment. Is there an interface, like where a small startup, relatively small, doesn't have established government lobby in Brussels, where can they get engaged in the EU and NATO?
Stijn, can you recommend an address on downtown, the Schumann district?
I would say that probably the Commission and the DG DEFIS would be the most natural point of entry for that type of discussion. And then, of course, connected to that, we have the EDF, the European Defence Fund, which actually has the financial tools to incentivize cooperation between member states consortia. So it depends also a bit whether or not this company is actually based in Europe or has at least a branch office in Europe, and whether it manages to find other partners on the European territory. And on that basis, it could start a conversation with the Commission, possibly introduce project proposals under the European Defence Fund.
And on NATO?
Yes, get back to us in 6 months. No, I'm just joking. We actually had the same question, and that was the very reason why we created Diana, the Defense Innovation sort of accelerator. Because, I mean, let's go back to the, like 70s, 80s, you know, put the man on the moon and the rest of it, right? I mean, it was largely government-driven, government-funded, the innovation part, and lots of sort of other technologies came out of it. Well, nowadays, I think I would say that it's the other way around, right? So the question is, how can the defense sector, how can NATO and our allies tap into that innovation? All of the sort of the startups and what have you, and that's exactly sort of the question that we're trying to answer with Diana. Give us some time, but meanwhile, feel free to refer this person to me, I guess.
Okay. Thank you. Did I see another hand here? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Florian Egloff from the Swiss government. I have a question regarding this on peace or the strategic competition short of war that was alluded to, and some of the measures that were taken to try to respond to that. Some of them were mentioned, joint statements, other things like cyber sanctions on the EU side. There's some question around the effectiveness of it. And so, like Christian Lifländer alluded to, potentially going the persistent engagement route. I would open up a bit this question a bit broader and say, how do you shape competition into a space where you're likely to have an advantage? So as an open question to the panel, Like, what are the things that you think, or the levers that you take to try to shape this competition in a space where NATO or the EU is deemed to win, or at least have a long-lasting strategic advantage?
Good question.
I guess that's... She seems to be indicating willingness to respond to it.
No, it's a good question, and it's a question that we get asked a lot if we talk about sanctions, like how effective are they, and is there a value of having sanctions at the first? And still, sanctions are not a means in itself. They're a tool in order to try to influence behavior of the malicious actors. But that's not just one of the elements why they are important and why they matter, just like the declarations that we did. They also matter to signal to the broader audience, as I was saying, but they also matter for our conversations with other nations, with third parties, people in the global south that we work and want to be more understanding of our norms. So they are a tool for us in order to foster and strengthen that conversation in assuring that they understand what threats we are seeing and why we want to respond the way we did, and hopefully enhance the capacity building of those nations by fostering those sort of conversations. So they have a broader use, and not only a use within the EU and NATO, but also in our conversations at the UN and other fora, but also in just bilateral conversations. So I think there still is a good use and a good reason for us to be considering those, even though I don't think, as Christian was saying, cyberspace is always on. So it's you need to be carefully assuring when you want to respond, but they truly have a measure, and that's also why on the EU side recently we've have to renew our sanctions on a yearly basis. But we also renewed the sanction regime, and we didn't renew it for 1 year, but we've renewed it for the coming 3 years, because we recognize that cyber is a domain where we will be facing sanctions, because we need to be able to have that tool in order to impose costs to those actors and set the boundaries there.
Thank you. Margiris, is this something you'd like to reflect upon?
No, that was a very broad and open question, on this on peace and strategic implications of it. I think couple of elements from my side would be important to keep in mind in addition to what has been said. The one is deterrence piece. How we see deterrence in cyber world, and because this is cyber is always on. We always have a cyber conflicts and attacks. So how can you deter adversaries or malicious actors not to do that, or reconsider? And I'm focusing and talking about state-sponsored maybe more. Because when it comes to criminals, of course, we have another logic of business model, and I think universal practices how we deal with criminals also helps you to deal in cyberspace. But on state-sponsored level, there are two ways to do deterrence. One is deterrent by denial, and the other is deterrent by punishment. So in cyber, I think deterrent by denial is not working. You could have maybe this in physical space, not in cyberspace. But deterrence by punishment is probably one of the ways to see how we can really have some effects and of how we can deter the adversaries. And one interesting also in the context of Ukraine, how this works. We haven't spoken about this phenomena of public support and public white hackers activity, which could be seen as something deterrence by punishment for the other side. So that is one aspect. The other aspect, when it comes to strategic competition, I think we should not shy away from a view that we are more and more moving when it comes to technology, when it comes to cyber, to more bipolar world. And I know that for some, we don't like to see it only through bipolar perspective, but in reality, on the one hand, we have autocracies, on the other side, we have democracies. And we should very much acknowledge that and work together among democracies, starting with all those issues we have discussed before, to also technology piece that we should definitely try to minimize our dependence on the other side and be very conscious what risk it can bring. So this is my answer to this very broad question, which could have many angles.
Thank you. Do you want to tackle this on the other side?
Well, perhaps very briefly, because I think a lot has been said. I think in this global battle of narratives, so to speak, what Liesje referred to are actions in terms of promoting international norms of responsible state behavior, etc. I think that will remain a key component, and trying to build a very large alliance behind that, because I mean that's the first part. And then the second part, looking ahead, I think what Margiris said is absolutely crucial, and perhaps we did not dwell on that for long enough in this panel, but it's really about mastering the technologies of the future, making sure that Europe has on its own territory as well, it masters the technologies that will be essential going ahead. 5G, of course, is a prime example, but it's not the only one. And I think there, from the EU side, I mean, you mentioned the Diana, the European Defence Agency has just created an innovation hub, but of course the Commission also has a massive amount of funding available through Horizon 2020 and a number of other programs, the European Defence Fund, PESCO, and what you will see is that we will further develop these incentives and make sure that, we reduce to the extent possible our strategic dependencies from other countries in this regard. And I think that will be crucial, but obviously a very long-term effort.
Thank you. Christian, you have the last word on this.
Yeah, I did mention the joint publication 3-12, right? I mean, so I kind of have to come back to you on that one. Excellent document. I recommend people read it, because I think sometimes folks actually make more out of it than it is, and get confused and scared and what have you. But that is just, for me, this is just part of the puzzle, right? I mean, I'm looking at the whole Dynfield spectrum. There are other means, going back to what was discussed here as well, diplomatic, signaling, and et cetera, et cetera. And to be very honest, a big part of it is also legal. I mean, Tallinn Manual, for example, how it contributed to our understanding of how the existing body of international law applies. I guess what it is mostly is about the mindset. It's about sort of thinking and connecting the dots and actively shaping that space. That's what we're after. But I think if I had one sort of recommendation, is not to be deterred by our own fear. We are part of that competition. The question I think we need to answer is, how do we want to compete?
Excellent. I think excellent words and excellent maybe takeaway from this NATO-EU panel. Let's not be deterred by our own fear. Let's be bold in these difficult times, and I am also thankful for this panel, for your excellent thoughts, for the audience. I think everybody's deserved a great applause. Thank you very much.